See, father, he is big and strong. Father, will you play with Jane? Father is smiling. Smile, father, smile, smile. When Charlie was 4 days old, his mother wrapped him in two blankets and one newspaper and placed him on a junk heap by the railroad. His great aunt Jimmy, who had seen her niece carrying a bundle out of the back door, rescued him. She beat his mother with a razor strap and wouldn't let her near the baby after that. Aunt Jimmy raised Charlie herself, but took delight sometimes in telling him of how she had saved him. He gathered from her that his mother wasn't right in the head, but he never had a chance to find out because she ran away shortly after the razor strap, and no one ever heard of her since. Charlie was grateful for having been saved, except sometimes. Sometimes when he watched Aunt Jimmy eating collards with her fingers, sucking her four gold teeth, and smelled her when she wore the asafoetida bag around her neck, or when she made him sleep with her for warmth in winter, and he could see her old wrinkled breasts sagging in her nightgown. Then he wondered whether it would have been just as well to have died there, down in the rim of a tire under the soft black Georgia sky. He had 4 years of school before he got the courage enough to ask his aunt who and where his father was. That Fuller boy, I believe it was, his aunt said. He was hanging around then, but he'd taken off pretty quick before you was born. I think he got to Macon. Him or his brother, maybe both. I hear old Fuller man say something about it once. What was his name? What name he have? Asked Charlie. Fuller, foolish. I mean, what his given name? Oh, she closed her eyes to think and sighed. Can't recollect nothing no more. Sam, was it? Yeah, Samuel. No, it wasn't. It was Samson. Samson Fuller. How come you all didn't name me Samson? Charlie's voice was low. What for? He wasn't nowhere around when you was born. Your mama didn't name you nothing. The 9 days wasn't up before she throwed you on the junk heap. When I got you, I named you myself on the 9th day. You named after my dead brother, Charles Breedlove, a good man. Ain't no Samson never come to no good end. Charlie didn't ask anything else. 2 years later, he quit school to take a job at Tyson's feed and grain store. He swept up, ran errands, weighed bags, and lifted them onto the drays. Sometimes they let him ride with the drayman, a nice old man called Blue Jack. Blue used to tell him old-timey stories about how it was when the Emancipation Proclamation came, how the black people hollered, cried, and sang, and ghost stories about how a white man cut off his wife's head and buried her in the swamp, and the headless body came out at night and went stumbling around the yard, knocking over stuff because it couldn't see, and crying all the time for a comb. They talked about the women Blue had had and the fights he'd been in when he was younger, about how he talked his way out of getting lynched once, and how others hadn't. Charlie loved Blue. Long after he was a man, he remembered the good times they'd had, how on a July 4 at a church picnic, a family was about to break open a watermelon. Several children were standing around watching. Blue was hovering about on the periphery of the circle, a faint smile of anticipation softening his face. The father of the family lifted the melon high over his head, his big arms taller than the trees to Charlie, and the melon blotted out the sun. Tall, head forward, eyes fastened on a rock, his arms higher than the pines, his hands holding a melon bigger than the sun. He paused an instant to get his bearing and secure his aim. Watching the figure etched against the bright blue sky, Charlie felt goose pimples popping along his arms and neck. He wondered if God looked like that. No, God was a nice old white man with long white fur, flowing white beard, and little blue eyes that looked sad when people died and mean when they were bad. It must be the devil who looks like that, holding the world in his hands, ready to dash it to the ground and spill the red guts so N-word could eat the sweet warm insides. If the devil didn't look like that, Charlie preferred him. If the devil did look like that, Charlie preferred him. He never felt anything thinking about God, but just the idea of the devil excited him. And now the strong black devil was blotting out the sun and getting ready to split open the world. Far away, someone was playing a mouth organ. The music slithered over the cane fields and into the pine grove. It spiraled around the tree trunks and mixed itself with the pine scent, so Charlie couldn't tell the difference between the sound and the odor that hung about the heads of people. The man swung the melon down to the edge of a rock. A soft cry of disappointment accompanied the sound of smashed rind. The break was a bad one. The melon was jagged and the hunks of rind and red meat scattered on the grass. Blue jumped. Ah, he moaned. There go to heart. His voice was both sad and pleased. Everybody looked to see the big red chunk from the very center of the melon, free of rind and sparse of seed, which had rolled a little distance from Blue's feet. He stooped to pick it up. Blood red, its planes dull and blunted with sweetness, its edges rigid with juice, too obvious, almost obscene in the joy it promised. Go ahead, Blue, the father laughed. You can have it. Blue smiled and walked away. Little children scrambled for the pieces on the ground. Women picked out the seeds for the smallest ones and broke off little bits of meat for themselves. Blue's eye caught Charlie's. He motioned to him. Come on, boy. Let you and me eat the heart. Together, the old man and the boy sat on the grass and shared the heart of the watermelon, the nasty sweet guts of the earth. It was in the early spring, a very chilly spring, that Aunt Jimmy died of peach cobbler. She went to a camp meeting that took place after a rainstorm, and the damp wood of the benches was bad for her. For 4 or 5 days afterwards, she felt poorly. Friends came to see about her. Some made chamomile tea, others rubbed her with the liniment. Miss Alice, her closest friend, read the Bible to her. She was still declining. Advice was prolific, if contradictory. Don't eat no white eggs. Drink new milk. Chew on this root. Aunt Jimmy ignored all but Miss Alice's Bible readings. She nodded in drowsy appreciation as the words from the 1 Corinthians droned over her. Sweet amens fell from her lips as she was chastised for all her sins, but her body would not respond. We are actually going to skip over, and we're going to start on the bottom of 139. 139. Very bottom, on a wet Saturday night. On a wet Saturday night, before Aunt Jimmy felt strong enough to get out of bed, Essie Foster brought her a peach cobbler. The old lady ate a piece, and the next morning, when Charlie went to empty the slop jar, she was dead. Her mouth was a slackened O, and her hands, those long fingers with the white man's hard nails, having done their laying by, could now be dainty on the sheet. One open eye looked as if to say, Mind how you take hold of that jar, boy. Charlie stared back, unable to move, until a fly settled at the corner of her mouth. He fanned it away angrily, looked back at the eye, and did its bidding. Aunt Jimmy's funeral was the first Charlie had ever attended. As a member of the family, one of the bereaved, he was the object of a great deal of attention. The ladies had cleaned the house, aired everything out, notified everybody, and stitched together what looked like a white wedding dress for Aunt Jimmy, a maiden lady, to wear when she met Jesus. They even produced a dark suit, white shirt, and tie for Charlie. The husband of one of them cut his hair. He was enclosed in fastidious tenderness. Nobody talked to him, that is, they treated him like the child he was, never engaging him in serious conversation, but they anticipated wishes he never had. Meals appeared, hot water for the wooden tub, clothes laid out. At the wake, he was allowed to fall asleep and arms carried him to bed. Only on the 3rd day after the death, the day of the funeral, did he have to share the spotlight. Aunt Jimmy's people came from nearby towns and farms, her brother O.V. and children and wife, and lots of cousins. But Charlie was still the major figure, because he was Jimmy's boy, the last thing she loved, and the one who found her. The solicitude of the women, the head pats of the men pleased Charlie, and the creamy conversations fascinated him. What'd she die from? Essie's pie. Don't say. And we're going to skip. The ladies are just having a conversation, saying it would cost $85 to keep Aunt Jimmy's house. So Charlie's probably going to go live with Jimmy's brother. And let's pick up on 143 in the middle where it says Charlie had not yet fully realized. 143. Charlie had not yet fully realized his aunt was dead. Everything was so interesting. Even at the graveyard, he felt nothing but curiosity v- when his turn had come to view the body at the church. He had put his hand out to touch the corpse, but to see if it was really ice cold like everybody said. But he drew his hand back quickly. Aunt Jimmy looked so private, and he seemed wrong somehow to disturb that privacy. He had trudged back to his pew, dry eyed, amid tearful shrieks and shouts of others, wondering if he should try to cry. Back in his house, he was free to join in the gaiety and enjoy what he really felt, a kind of carnival spirit. He ate greedily and felt good enough to try to get to know his cousins. There was some question, according to the adults, as to whether they were his real cousins or not, since Jimmy's brother O.V. was only a half brother and Charlie's mother had been the daughter of Jimmy's sister. But that sister was from a second marriage of Jimmy's father, and O.V. was from the first marriage. One of these cousins interested Charlie in particular. He was about 15 or 16 years old. Charlie went outside and found the boy standing with some others near the tub where Aunt Jimmy used to boil her clothes. He ventured a tentative hey. They responded with another. The 15-year-old named Jake offered Charlie a rolled-up cigarette. Charlie took it, but when he held the cigarette at arm's length and stuck the tip of it into the match flame, instead of putting it in his mouth and drawing on it, they laughed at him. Shamefaced, he threw the cigarette down. He felt it important to do something to reinstate himself with Jake. So when he had asked Charlie if he knew any girls, Charlie said, "Sure." All the girls Charlie knew were at the banquet, and he pointed to a cluster of them standing, hanging, draping on the back porch. Darlene, too. Charlie hoped Jake wouldn't pick her. Let's get some and walk around," said Jake. The two boys sauntered over to the porch. Charlie didn't know how to begin. Jake wrapped his legs around the rickety porch rail and just sat there staring off into space, as though he had no interest in them at all. He was letting them look him over, and guardedly evaluating them in return. The girls pretended they didn't see the boys and kept on chattering. Soon their talk got sharp. The gentle teasing they had been engaged in with each other changed to bitchiness, a serious kind of making fun. That was Jake's clue. The girls were reacting to him. They had gotten a whiff of his manhood and were shivering for a place in his attention. Jake left the porch rail and walked right up to a girl named Suki, the one who had been most bitter in her making fun. "Want to show me around?" He didn't even smile. Charlie held his breath, waiting for Suki to shut Jake up. She was good at that and well known for her sharp tongue. To his enormous surprise, she readily agreed and even lowered her lashes. Taking courage, Charlie turned to Darlene and said, "Come on, Long. We're just going down to the gully." He waited for her to screw up her face and say no, or what for, or some such thing. His feelings about her were mostly fear. Fear that she would not like him, and fear that she would. His second fear materialized. She smiled and jumped down the 3 leaning steps to join him. Her eyes were full of compassion, and Charlie remembered that he was the bereaved. "If you want to," she said, "but not too far. Mama said we gotta leave early and it's getting dark." The 4 of them moved away. Some of the other boys had come to the porch and were about to begin that partly hostile and partly indifferent, partly desperate mating dance. Suki and Jake, Darlene, and Charlie walked through several backyards until they came to an open field. They ran across it and came to a dry riverbed lined with green. The object of the walk was a wild vineyard where the muscadine grew. Too new, too tight to have much sugar. They were eaten anyway. None of them wanted, not then, the grape's easy relinquishing of all its dark juice. The restraint, the holding off, the promise of sweetness had yet to unfold, excited them more than the full ripeness would have done. At last, their teeth were on edge, and the boys diverted themselves by pelting the girls with the grapes. Their slim black boy wrists made G clefs in the air as they executed the tosses. The chase took Charlie and Darlene away from the lip of the gully, and when they paused for a breath, Jake and Sookie were nowhere in sight. Darlene's white cotton dress was stained with juice. Her big blue hair bow had come undone, and the sundown breeze was picking it up and fluttering it about her head. They were out of breath and sank down in the green and purple grass on the edge of the pine woods. Charlie lay on his back, panting, his mouth full of the taste of muscadine, listening to the pine needles rustling loudly in the anticipation of rain. The smell of promised rain, pine, and muscadine made him giddy. The sun had gone and pulled away its shreds of light, turning his head to see where the moon was. Charlie caught sight of Darlene in the moonlight behind him. She was huddled into a D, arms encircling drawn-up knees, on which she rested her head. Charlie could see her bloomers and the muscles of her young thighs. "We bed get on back," he said. "Yeah." She stretched her legs flat on the ground and began to retie her hair ribbon. "Mama gonna whoop me." "Nah, she ain't." "Uh-huh. She told me she would if I get dirty." "You ain't dirty." "I am too. Look at that." She dropped her hands from the ribbon and smoothed out a place on her dress where the grape stains were heaviest. Charlie felt sorry for her. It was just as much his fault. Suddenly he realized that Aunt Jimmy was dead, for he missed the fear of being whipped. There was nobody to do it except Uncle Ovi, and he was the bereaved too. "Let me," he said. He rose to his knees facing her and tried to tie her ribbon. Darlene put her hands under his open shirt and rubbed the damp, tight skin. When he looked at her in surprise, she stopped and laughed. He smiled and continued knotting the bow. She put her hands back under his shirt. "Hold still," he said. "How I gonna get this?" She tickled his ribs with her fingertips. He giggled and grabbed his ribcage. They were on top of each other in a moment. She corkscrewing her hands into his clothes, he returning the play, digging into the neck of her dress and then under the dress. When he got his hand on her bloomers, she suddenly stopped laughing and looked serious. Charlie, frightened, was about to take his hand away, but she held his wrist so he couldn't move it. He examined her then with his fingers, and she kissed his face and mouth. Charlie found her muscadine-lipped mouth distracting. Darlene released his head, shifted her body, and pulled down her pants. After some trouble with the buttons, Charlie dropped his pants down to his knees. Their bodies began to make sense to him, and it was not as difficult as he had thought it would be. She moaned a little, but the excitement collecting inside him made him close his eyes and regard her moans as no more than pine sighs over his head. Just as he felt an explosion threaten, Darlene froze and cried. He thought he had hurt her, but when he looked at her face, she was staring wildly at something over his shoulder. He jerked around. There stood two white men, one with a spirit lamp, the other with a flashlight. There was no mistake about them being white. He could smell it. Charlie jumped, trying to kneel, stand, and get his pants up all in one motion. The men had long guns. He. The next page has a lot of explicit content. So we're going to pause right here.